discussing who is the Lord, and really a study of His nature. But before we get to that, we want to look at, first of all, the positive arguments for His actual existence. And again, this is not a course on Christian evidences per se. If it were, then we would spend some time, a lot of time, debunking or talking about those things that show that the evolutionary theory is not possible and that kind of thing. And we're not going to do that. But it's not enough just to show that atheism or evolution is false, but we want to give positive arguments. And of course, mainly it's a philosophical argument that God, our God, and the God of the Bible does exist. We know that, and when I say philosophical, God can't be measured scientifically or through the scientific method. You can't put God in a test tube, per se. And so, at least not His unaltered essence. Now, we did mention that according to John, 1 John chapter 1, obviously when Christ was here in the flesh, and He was God in the flesh, He could be handled, He could be heard, seen, and touched. And so to that extent, of course, Christ could be seen in the flesh. But certainly, by and large, then, what we're looking is what we would call indirect evidence, and science uses this all the time. That is, we extrapolate from the known to the unknown, and we do that in our everyday lives. And frankly, to be honest, we do that in everything that we do. If you are familiar with the criminal justice system at all, by and large, most convictions take place on indirect evidence. It's not necessarily eyewitness testimony or things of this nature. So there's nothing wrong with that. It is a valid source of information if it's true. Now, evolution, of course, the evolutionary theory attempts to use what they believe to be indirect evidence for their theory, but of course we can show that to be false. But we're talking about proofs for God's existence. And we mentioned last week that these philosophical arguments that have been around, for millennia, a couple thousand years or more. And it's interesting, whereas with the theory of evolution, it is a situation where adjustments are constantly being made in the theory because something gets falsified, or they decide, well, that's just not going to work. And so they're constantly moving, and changing. These philosophical arguments for the existence of God really haven't changed a whole lot, and the reason for that is because they haven't been falsified. No one's been able to refute them, and so they're just as good today as they were when someone first articulated them. Now, the first one we want to look at is what we're going to call, and what has been called, the intuitional argument, and that is the fact that belief in a creator, an all-powerful creator, comes naturally to human beings. Okay? So it's the fact that there's this inherent predisposition to recognize this fact. And so the interesting thing about the intuitional argument, and that is that mankind has this inherent predisposition to believe that things are created and designed, and that there's an overruling power in the universe, is actually acknowledged not just by theists but by atheists. Now, they might not if they're in a room full of rabid atheists and they're trying to stir up the crowd. But in their writings, some of the most famous atheists in the world will agree that it comes natural for people. In other words, to believe that there's not a God and to believe in evolution, frankly, they will admit is unnatural for people. And so, for instance, you've probably heard of the name Richard Dawkins, one of the world's leading atheistic thinkers. He's admitted that this religion is universal to mankind, and it's been in every culture ever studied. He talks about how deeply religious people are. Now, what we're going to talk about today is that they give different reasons for that. Okay? And they have what they think are their explanations. But they will admit that it's true. Christopher Hitchens, you may have heard of him. He's dead now, but he was an atheistic writer who wrote that Sigmund Freud admitted this. Freud said, in talking about this religious impulse in his book, The Future of an Illusion, said that this is essentially, you can't eradicate it until we overcome our fear of death. You know, Freud said basically this is man's way of dealing with his fears, is that he invents this idea of a creator. But here's the interesting thing. There's several scientists who've done research, studies on children. And these are atheistic scientists. Here's two, Paul Bloom and Dina Skolnick-Weisberg. They wrote an article called Childhood Origins of Adult Resistance to Science. Now, keep in mind, when an evolutionist uses the word science, okay, he's not talking about real science. That is, science like the laws of science that everybody accepts. He's talking about naturalistic evolutionary theory. That's the way they use the term science. And in their study and in this article they wrote, they said children tend to attribute purpose and design to virtually everything. They call it promiscuous teleology. And when asked about the origins of animals and people, children spontaneously tend to provide and prefer creationist explanations. Another woman wrote an article titled, Are Children Intuitive Theists? And she concluded that they are. Another woman in a long article said, why is the human mind, at least the Western Protestant mind, so susceptible to creationism and so comparatively resistant to naturalistic explanations for the origins of species? And so again, all these people are atheists who were studying children and coming to the conclusion, if you leave a child alone, his tendency, his predisposition, is to explain the universe and to explain what he sees around him in terms of creation, in terms of a higher power. And so, finally, this Paul Bloom admitted after all this research said, there is by now a large body of research suggesting that humans are natural-born creationists. When we see non-random structure and design, we assume that it was created by an intelligent being. Well, whoa, what about that? Yeah, when I see structure and design, that's what I assume. He opined evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins was right to complain that it seems, quote, as if the human brain were specifically designed to misunderstand Darwinism. So, here's the deal. Atheists and theists agree that there's this intuitive human tendency to believe in an intelligent creator from the time you're a child. So, what's the problem here then? Well, the problem is, of course, if you're an atheist, you've got to explain that in some way that fits with atheistic evolutionary theory. That is, why do children think that way? So, and you're saying, well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is this. They believe everything has a naturalistic cause. So, what is it? What does evolution teach as far as what is the mechanism which pushes evolution along? What is it that they're teaching? The theist believes that the world was created perfect, complete, and we're going from order to disorder. Everything around us is going from order to disorder. It's running down, right? Even our gene pool. The atheist believes that everything is going from what to what? Yeah, from disorder to order. Everything's it's evolving. It's supposedly getting better. What is the mechanism for that? What do they call that? What is it that living organisms do to get better? What do they call it?
Natural selection.
Yeah, natural selection. The survival of the fittest. So if a particular organism has something that's disadvantageous to its survival, eventually, it'll be gone. For instance, let's suppose, we can keep this simple, there's a small group of humans that decides that Kodiak bears would make great pets. Right? Grizzly bears would make great pets. There's some small group of people that decides that. Well, that problem, that stupid idea is going to work itself out on its own. Why? Because the Kodiaks are going to eat all those people. And so we won't have to worry about those people anymore. So that's kind of the way evolution works. I mean, that's a silly illustration, but that's the way it works. So here's the problem with religion. According to atheists and evolutionary theory, if a certain group of people spend a lot of effort and money and time on religious ceremonies that have nothing to do with survival, well, then they would say that's a waste, right? I mean, in other words, religion has nothing to do with you surviving physically, so thriving, and the ones that are shouldn't be thriving because they're wasting their time and money on things that don't help them survive. They don't help their particular species survive. That's what evolutionary theory would expect. Religion is wasteful, and Darwinian selection, that is evolution, should eliminate waste. And they will admit that. So this one, Dawkins said, religion is wasteful. And so it should be eliminated. Another guy said, whatever else religion is a human phenomenon, it is hugely costly endeavor. Right? Well, what do they mean by that? Listen to what this guy said. When he's looking at religion and humanity all over the world, this is an atheist. What they see today is a population of over 6 billion people, almost all of whom devote a significant fraction of their time and energy to some sort of religious activity, like daily prayer, attendance at ceremonies, costly sacrifices. What about this? Not working on certain days, no matter what crisis might be coming, no matter how bad you need the money, you're not going to work on a certain day. And so you do all this stuff, and Dawkins says, well, that's wasteful. I mean, it can actually endanger your life and the life of other people. How many people have been tortured for their religious beliefs? See? Persecuted. Died for what they believed in. And he says, what's the benefit? Now, occasionally, some atheists come along and say, well, there are some benefits to religion. What are the benefits to religion that you sometimes hear? Now, I'm not talking about spiritual and eternal benefits. Yeah, but what does that do for me? Religious people, what does it generally do for me physically? Because that's what an atheist is looking at. Remember, to an atheist, everything is naturalistic. Everything's about the physical. So what are some benefits of religion for me? Sometimes.
You feel better about yourself.
Which happens, but still, feeling better about myself is not a physical thing. But studies have proven that religion generally does what? What are some of the benefits that I derive from that?
Sense of community.
Okay, a sense of community, but again, studies have shown, for instance, like people live longer, they have lower blood pressure, they have less stress. Those are all tangible physical benefits of religion. Okay? That atheists will admit that there are some minor advantages. But, again, those are not big enough to justify it.
To justify religion.
Yeah, to justify religion. Yeah, there's a few minor physical benefits that people get from that, but that's still not enough. And so, you're going to love this. The atheistic consensus is that even with that, it doesn't increase what they would call human fitness. And so, they have to come up with a way to explain the existence and just the fact that religion continues in the world, even though it is so costly and so wasteful. It makes no sense when it comes to evolutionary theory. So what do they say? What is religion? What's the problem?
They say it's the opiate of the people.
Well, it is the opiate of the people, but more specifically, they have decided that religion is a virus.
Oh.
Virus. Okay? Now, you get physical viruses, right? And so this kind of virus is similar to a physical virus, but it's a mind virus. A virus is a parasite, right? So here's what the atheistic community is concocting. That theistic ideas are like a mind virus that infect you, not for your benefit, but for the benefit of the virus. You see? Because it just gets passed on from human host to human host for its survival. And they've come up with a word for that. Anybody know what they call that? It's kind of like the common cold, in other words. Anybody know what they call it? M-E-M-E. It's called a meme. A meme. You may have seen this term on social media. It's kind of evolved over the years. Yeah, M-E-M-E. A meme is the way it's pronounced, I believe. And that's what they call it. The meme theory. And here's what they say. They say, look, let's look at religion. Here's what one guy said. Once a person converts to a religion, it's difficult to have a rational conversation with him about his irrational aspects of his religion. It's like something has invaded him and taken over his personality. We'll get to that. So here's what one guy said. He said he had a friend who was not religious, but after his father died, he got this severe case, called as a severe case, of religion, and it changed his personality dramatically. And this guy goes on to say that, stress can activate the chickenpox virus in adults, leading to shingles, right? So similarly to that, stress tends to reactivate the God virus in people. So you get under stress and the God virus gets you. And it's a virus because it's always functioning to ensure its own survival. Now you're going to love this. He says, go to any Christian bookstore and you will find books about living in a secular world, living with a spouse who is not saved, or how to convert friends and relatives. The God virus is always concerned with protecting and expanding its territory. That is what these books are all about. See? God virus. Well, as I think Ashley just mentioned, let's take that to its logical conclusion. How do we show the fallacy of that? All right, so you say religion is a virus. That is, religious thought is a virus. Well, if thoughts or ideas are self-sustaining and they're these self-replicating memes that are simply out for their own survival, then why wouldn't the idea of atheism be one of those viruses? You see, what proves too much doesn't prove anything, right? I mean, after all, isn't atheism one of those things that's trying to ensure its own survival to the potential detriment of its host? And frankly, when it gets down to it, if there is such a thing as mental viruses, idea viruses, and this is pretty silly, how would you ever tell the difference between an idea that was a virus or it wasn't a virus? I mean, how could any of us have any rational conversation about anything? Because frankly, it might be a virus. My ideas and the way I think might just be a virus. And you see how silly it becomes.
How would they explain, like, we've recently had some crisis with the hurricanes and such, and you've seen a lot of people come together to help those in need, and particularly members of religious organizations help people back in a lot of ways. From an evolutionist standpoint of view, how do they explain that? And then is that something that they would even believe that will be necessary based on their desire?
Yeah, I don't want to get too far afield into this because I'm really trying to focus on just this idea of the intuitive argument for the existence of God. But it is a good question. That is, atheism is supposed to be about, evolution is supposed to be about the survival of the fittest. So the question becomes, the question Marv is posing is that why do people come together to help other people? How does that help my survival? What good does that do me? And I'm sure the atheist has some, he has some goofy answer like, oh, well, that, you know, maybe that helps my community indirectly, helps me, or it'll come back and makes me feel. But still, all in all, it doesn't make much sense because let's face it. When we look at animals, and they live in, as we like to say, a dog-eat-dog world, animals don't, as a rule, they'll steal food out of each other's mouths. They eat each other. And if that's really what evolution and atheism is all about, it doesn't really make sense for us, as you say, to have that kind of care about other people. But I like what one writer says, and how would you set up any criteria for discerning between ideas that are memes, that are viruses, and those that aren't? Because that could be a meme. That could be a virus. And so really this kind of becomes a stupid argument. And eventually you could probably just argue that nobody's responsible for anything and just say my memes made me do it, which I guess is the way some people think anyway. So, let's think about what that guy just said about the people going in the bookstores, and buying books on salvation and how to convert their friends and how to perpetuate this virus. Well, atheists do the same thing, right? They got bookstores full of books on, how to persuade your friends to be an atheist. And frankly, they talk about atheism and evolution in terms of evangelizing and teaching other people and trying to rid them of these stupid religious ideas. So it's really the same thing. Well, that's a good question. And so really, their efforts are similar to religious efforts. And so you can't really distinguish between the two. So what does provide the answer when we say that people are intuitive theists? What is the obvious answer? It's not a virus that children have this predisposition. But it's what?
We're made in God's image.
Yeah, absolutely. We're made in God's image.
And Ecclesiastes says that God put it in the heart of man, eternity in the heart of man.
Yeah, that's exactly right. God has created us to have that predisposition. And atheists admit it. They admit that atheism is unnatural. I like what Dawkins said. He says, natural selection makes no intuitive sense, and then concludes that children are native teleologists and may never grow out of it. So they admit that we're naturally inclined to believe in a designer, and they have to admit that their own theory is unnatural and counterintuitive. And it's interesting, too, because if you're an atheist, how would atheism and how would evolution ever account for the fact that people are intuitive theists? That makes no sense whatsoever. Of course, to the atheist, people made up God, to fill some void or gap. But that still doesn't explain children. It doesn't explain children. So, if we have this theory, or this concept, this philosophical argument, it's not a theory, that we're going to establish the existence of God by this intuitive theism, and God expects His creatures to use this pre-programmed disposition, then what's next? Well, we establish, first of all, that God's Word, or the Bible, is God's Word, and we can do that. We may talk about that later. But what does God expect all of His creatures who are pre-programmed with that predisposition to do with that information? Yeah, let's turn back, and we've already looked at it. Let's look at it again. Turn back to Romans 1. Because it's interesting, as we're talking about this intuitive theism, this first argument for the existence of God, and that is that everybody is born with this predisposition. Look at 18 through 21. For For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who do what? What have these men done? Yes, suppress. They've suppressed the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is what? Manifest in them. For God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So it's interesting, we're born with this intuitive predisposition to believe in God, and yet, as I mentioned last week, and we talked about this idea of volitional balance, I don't have to accept that. I don't have to go down that road. Somebody says, well, why doesn't everybody obey Him then? What does the Bible say these people did with that intuitive predisposition? What did they do with it? They suppressed it. So I may be born with it. I may be born with an inclination or a predisposition to believe in God, and I may actually, as this verse says, I can actually look to the heavens and see that obviously there is a God. But if I want to go my own way, and I want to be my own God, then if I want to, I can suppress all of that. I can just put it to the back of my mind and say, even though as these atheists will admit, even though it is counterintuitive, even though it makes no sense whatsoever, I can decide that there is no God. And that the evolutionary theory, no matter how stupid it is, explains everything. That way, I can live my own life the way I want to, without guilt, and just have all the freedom I want to be my own little God and make all my own decisions and not be accountable to anybody. I can suppress all of that if I want to. I'm allowed to do that as a free moral agent, which is what these people have done. Go over to Acts chapter 17. We've got this sermon again on Mars Hill. Now look at verse. And this is in the middle of Paul's sermon, talking about the unknown God whom they worship without knowing. Him I proclaim to you, God who made the world, verse 24, and everything in it, since He is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is He worshipped with men's hands as though He needed anything, since He gives to all life, breath, and all things. And notice, and He is made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that what? So that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for Him, the New King James says, and find Him, though He is not far from every one of us. So, what are men expected to do? God gives us this predisposition, this intuitive knowledge that He exists. He's given us the heavens. He's given us His Word. And He says this is so because men should be groping. They should be looking. They should be investigating. They should be seeing what they can do to try to find Him and draw closer to Him. And that's the whole reason, as Sister Marlene said, He has set eternity in their hearts. And so psychologists and anthropologists all know, and they all believe from the studies, that children, if just left alone, will come up with some concept of God, because we as human beings naturally want to grope for Him. We want to find Him. And that is the intuitive argument for the existence of God. The fact that man has been made in such a way that when left to his own devices, he comes to the understanding, or he believes that there is some. He may not understand everything he needs to know about God if he doesn't have the Word of God to guide him. But he's going to believe in some concept of a higher power who is in control of everything. And And that is the intuitive argument. Any questions or comments before we move on to the next argument? God's existence.
Did you already say what percentage of time you make? I looked it up, 22% people don't have any religious affiliation. Like, you research showed that only 3.1% of them claim to be atheists, about 4 are not. So it doesn't appear to be a whole lot. Atheists out there.
Well, I think it's very difficult for me to understand someone who says, I know there's no God, because basically that makes him God. Because he's saying, I know everything. The one thing he might not know is that there is a God. All right, the cosmological argument for the existence of God, now that one is pretty well known. It's also known as what? When I say the cosmological argument, what am I talking about? Yeah, the fact that the cosmos is here, well, it had to come from somewhere. And so we normally call this argument what? I mean, after all, it couldn't have created itself. It didn't come from nothing. That's the first law of thermodynamics. So what do we call this argument? Teleological argument is the argument from what? Which we'll do next. That's the argument from what? You all know this. Teleological argument is the argument from design. The cosmological argument is the law of cause and effect. Hebrews 3:4, right? Hebrews 3:4. For every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God. If I see a house, it didn't get there by itself. Right? And what does the law of cause and effect say? In the natural realm. Indicates that what? Every material effect must have a what? An adequate, antecedent, or simultaneous cause. Every cause must have an adequate effect. For instance, if I lean up next to a mountain and it topples over, I didn't do that. Okay? That's not an adequate cause. All right? If I lay my Bible like that and a fly lands on it and it falls off, the fly didn't do that. Okay? Because the fly didn't weigh enough. That's not an adequate cause. So, every effect must have an adequate cause. That's the law of cause and effect. If matter wasn't placed here in the universe, it wouldn't be here. As Jethro Bodine would say, naught from naught equals naught. Right? I think it was Thomas Aquinas, you're familiar with that name, that first came up with the, credited for articulating this argument. But it's actually been around and recognized as far back as Plato and Aristotle. And frankly, this particular law is taken for granted in the scientific community. It is assumed. Because frankly, if scientists didn't recognize the law of cause and effect, they couldn't even carry on experiments. And they couldn't investigate anything. They couldn't test anything because science is all about finding regularities, things that are going to happen with regularity by nature. That's the goal of their experimentation. In other words, what's going to be the effect if we do this? And so if there wasn't that relationship, you couldn't even have scientific investigation. Albert Einstein wrote about it, talked about universal causation. And we know that's the way the universe works. If I get up today, I know when I get up, gravity is operating today, okay? And it's going to be operating tomorrow. And it's going to be operating the next day. If it didn't, what kind of world of chaos would we live in. Sometimes we talk about, we're not going to get off on this right now, maybe later, but one of those things that people talk about when it comes to pain, the idea of God and how can He exist with all the pain and suffering in the world and natural calamities. Well, what kind of world would we live in if God just haphazardly decided, a plane's going down and all 149 people on board are going to die, but I'll just haphazardly, and sometimes I'll pluck down and grab that plane and set it down, and then sometimes I won't. You couldn't live your life that way. The universe runs itself on regularly established laws, and this law of cause and effect is one of the very basic ones, and cannot be denied. So,
you'll hear people say, well, why did God let this happen? He could have stopped it.
right. And so it's interesting to me, and when I think about going back to the example of evolutionary theory, there's always, the Big Bang or whatever it is, and then when you ask, well, where did that material come from? So you just don't get an answer. According to the laws of the first and second laws of thermodynamics, this universe in which we live is not eternal. Nothing material is eternal. Only mind is. And so there has to be some ultimate cause. It always humors me, and I find it funny. It's not really funny, but you pick up the paper nowadays, and since they can't explain how things ultimately got here, or first got here, what's the latest, greatest craze in the scientific community as far as how people got here? Anybody know?
Came from outer space.
Outer space. These are scientists, supposedly. They're telling us we got here because of little green men. They're watching too many science fiction movies. But that's the latest thing, you're right, is that now it's, they've moved on. Well, we can't really, we don't know how we got here, but we know it wasn't God, so it's got to be naturalistic explanation. So the little green men are the reason we're here. And of course, again, the theist, the person who believes in God, has to ask the question, what? What's the next question? Where did the little green men come from? Again, when you're talking about the law of cause and effect, the cosmological argument, what we're talking about is what is the first and only uncaused cause. And that's what we're looking at. For anything to be here at all, there has to be an uncaused cause. Otherwise, what happens? We're just going to keep going back forever. But we know, according to the other scientific laws, with the natural universe, a physical universe, that's not possible. It's not eternal. It hasn't been here forever. So I can keep going back and saying, well, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, the little green men happened, and all that. But eventually, I've got to get back to that first uncaused cause. Who's behind it all? Because what's the law say? Every effect must have an adequate cause. That's the law. And as far as we know, scientific laws are what? They get to be called laws. Scientific laws are called laws. Why? Well, we know of no exceptions. We know of no exceptions. So, when we talk about the cosmological argument, that's what we're talking about. The fact is that there has to be an uncaused cause. It's fundamental to science, and frankly, it makes sense to us as well. And so, if matter is not eternal, then mind is eternal. That's the only thing that could be. And that, of course, is God. He is the first uncaused cause. Any questions or comments about that? After all, the Bible teaches what about God's nature? He is what? He is eternal. He is from everlasting to everlasting, the Bible says. And so with an eternal being, that takes care of that. Right? And he's an eternal being, which means he's not bound by time. He sees all of history, he sees all of human history at the same time, and in one point, we're talking about this. But he is the uncalled cause. All right, so that's the first two arguments as far as the existence of God is concerned. The intuitive argument, that is, people are born with a predisposition to believe in God, and that's admitted by the atheist. And number two, the cosmological argument, which has not been refuted, and that is every cause or every effect must have an adequate cause, and he is that uncaused first cause. So we'll pick up next week with the teleological argument for God's existence, that is the design argument. We'll try to move along. We won't spend too much time on these because we want to get more to the specifics of his nature.